Hola amores, welcome back to my channel. I hope that you guys are doing well and staying safe and sane through this current situation our country and the world is in. I'm not going to say the C word because then my video will get demonetized, even though half of my videos get demonetized anyway, so what's new? But anyway, so I'm back with another race topic video. I came across this article like a week and a half ago through an Instagram page that I follow, and they made a post about this article. And it is called The New Orleans Creoles Who Challenged Racism by Challenging Race Itself. And this article was published March 8th of this year. So, when it comes to the topic of race, particularly within the American context, I think we always hear, oh, that, America is so race obsessed. And you hear a lot of people, especially foreigners, that reject the two-tone racial system that has been historically used here. I think especially for those of us that come from foreign backgrounds, it's not unusual or uncommon for many of us or our parents or whoever to reject these two-tone labels. However, I feel like when talking about race in the US, we often leave out some Americans throughout history that challenged this racial system and who challenge the very idea of race and what it is, and just racism in general in the United States. One group in particular who did this were the Louisiana Creoles, who this article is about. So I'm just gonna read some sections of this article and just kind of give my thoughts as I go along. So as I said, the name is the New Orleans Creoles Who Challenged Racism by Challenging Race Itself. So the article starts off by talking about a man who lived or was born in 1834. He was a Civil War era civil rights pioneer. In 1864, he had lobbied for President Lincoln in the White House for African American voting rights. In 1877, he filed the first ever federal case challenging school segregation on behalf of his two school-aged sons who had been excluded from a whites-only school. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a quick image of what he looks like and also tell you guys what the authors thought. So the author said, coming face to face with Bartineau's image, that's his name, by the way. I think I completely forgot to say that. His name is E. Arnold Bartineau. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But she said, coming face to face with Bartineau's image, I was shocked. I had been reading about Bartineau for book research, but while Bartineau fought valiantly for the rights of Black Americans, he didn't look Black himself. In the photo, as you can see, his skin was fair, his eyes were light, and his hair was wavy. In contemporary America, he might read as Latino. Looking at the late great Bartineau reminded me that the way passersby perceive a stranger's race on the streets of America doesn't necessarily match their actual background. The leading civil rights litigants of the Reconstruction era, including Bartineau, lived these complex racial realities, and it led them to challenge racism by challenging the concept of race itself. Most were openly mixed-race Creoles from New Orleans with roots in both Africa and Europe. This gave them a piercing perspective on American white supremacy and a unique legal arsenal for attacking it. The article then goes on to speak about another famous Creole of the time who was a civil rights plaintiff, Homer Plessy, who challenged rail car segregation at the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896. And so he himself was described in the African American New Orleans Crusader newspaper as being as white as the average white Southerner. To launch his case, he had to out himself to the train conductor as being mixed race in order to get ejected by the white-only car. Plessy's ethnic background was estimated to be 7/8 European and 1/8 African, but it was impossible to pin down for sure. And that was kind of like the whole point. As Plessy's lawyers asked the Supreme Court and justices, is not the question of race very often impossible of determination? Plessy's case was an attempt to resist not merely segregation, but binary racial labels like whites and colored altogether. And I think the question that they posed there is not the question of race, very often impossible of determination. I think it's a very valid question. Even today, when it comes to the topic of mixed race people, whether they be, biracial products of one black and one white child, or multiracial people being the product of generational mixing, we often come to this question, well, how then do you determine what someone's race is when you're in fact not just one race? And that's when people ask the question, well, what percentage of a certain race does it take to be considered this race? There is no general consensus. There is no, in my opinion, scientific way to prove that a person is just one race when your bloodline says something different. I think especially on this side of the world, a lot of us are the product of lines and lines of different ancestors from various parts of the world. So it just makes that question of, well, what race are you, difficult. I think the only people that may be able to say that they are just one race are certain white Americans, maybe, whose family was able to maintain their bloodline pure, I guess, or certain indigenous people within Latin America, as well as certain smaller black groups of people in Latin America. But for the most part, we're all mixed race. So what race are we really? And a lot of people say, well, mixed race isn't a race. You have to pick one. And it's like, but why? So anyway, it was only after Plessy, Bartineau, and the other leaders of the first civil rights movement had been defeated, and indeed because of their defeats, that the black and white binary solidified. Even on the census, multiracial options dwindled and then died out. Tellingly, on the 1910 census, Homer Plessy was black, but in 1920, white. So that just, again, shows how flawed this whole racial categorization system can be. Like, how do you go from being black, 1 year to being white another year? And that reminds me of, I remember when I was looking up Puerto Rican racial history, that kind of happened there too, where a lot of people that had been previously considered black were now being written down as white on the census, especially after US, took over. These early Creole civil rights activists who fought against the constricting racial categories of black or white defined themselves not by color, but by culture, much as Latinos in the U.S. do today. Creoles come in every shade and had no pretense to racial purity. What bound the community together was their linguistic roots in a Romance language, French and its Caribbean Creole offshoots, and their Mediterranean-infused mindset. So I found that very interesting that they included or kind of compared how the Creoles kind of functioned or how they viewed race, similar to how Latinos view race. A lot of you you've probably heard me say, for those of you that have been following me for a while, or a lot of other Latinos say that we don't classify ourselves by race or whatever. We identify more by our culture, our shared ethnicity. And I did a video some months back. I forget exactly how I titled it, but it was something about the importance of culture or why culture is important, something like that. But anyway, I said in that video that I believe that culture many times is a more binding factor than race itself, because within your culture is where your shared values lie. The shared values, the shared customs, the shared traditions, the language, all of that rests within your culture. And, using Dominicans as an example, we often say, we're a mixed race people, blah, blah, blah. We all band together under our shared culture. And, people can say whatever they want, but I agree with that. Racism aside, I do think that most Dominicans, regardless of their color, their race, whatever, most of us are pretty bound together due to our shared culture. There is no separation so much of culture based on race. So, I just found that, again, very interesting that they made that comparison. So, following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, as Latin American Nueva Orleans was turned into Anglo-American New Orleans, the Creole community was racialized by outsiders. Anglo-Americans who were very wary of influential freeborn Creoles and who were increasingly making whiteness a prerequisite for citizenship, obsessed over who among the Creoles had family tree roots in African soil. The Anglo-Americans began revoking rights, including suffrage, on the murky basis of race. Soon after the purchase, they passed an anti-miscegenation law requiring whites to marry whites, blacks to marry blacks, and biracial people to marry one another. So activists like Bertineau and Plessy, who descended from the third group, the mixed race people, fought against all racial categorizations. They were skeptical of the Anglos' concept of race and their arrogant presumption to assign it on sight. Okay, again, just faulty all over, because a lot of times genotype doesn't match phenotype. You can't always automatically correctly assess a person's race based on their appearance. After all, Plessy had to explicitly tell the train conductor that he was mixed race to launch his test case. This Plessy guy, he looked white, just straight up white, but the reality was that he was not fully 100% white. So, for nearly 30 years, Creole activists brought a series of cases that needled the Anglo-Americans' binary view of race. This legal tradition was launched at the height of radical Reconstruction when the light-skinned, newly elected Orleans Parish Sheriff Charles St. Albin Salvinut was refused a drink in a French quarter bar in 1870 and responded by suing for violation of his civil rights. So apparently his roots were in the Caribbean, where race was no black or white matter. He said, quote unquote, "Whether I am a colored man or not is a matter I myself do not know," he told the court. And he pointed out that no one could know anyone's race for sure. Of his two drinking buddies, he remarked, "Finnegan and Conklin, who are with me, are said to be white men. I do not know. To all appearances, they are. But of course, as Sheriff Salvinit himself proved, you couldn't necessarily ascertain people's backgrounds by sight." And the second person who had experienced something similar was the Creole Josephine de Coeur in her challenge to riverboat segregation. In 1872, she'd bought a first-class ladies' cabin ticket for a journey upriver from New Orleans, only to be asked to move to the inferior colored cabin. The ship's crew cuttingly referred to that section as the Freedmen's Bureau, which de Coeur took as a grave insult since she'd been born free into a wealthy slave-holding family. In court, de Coeur, who had roots on the European, African, and Native American continents, was described as being the color of a law book. To problemize the whole concept of race for the jury, her attorney called to the stand a light-skinned French Quarter resident of Caribbean descent. In New Orleans, where his Creole heritage was widely known, his name was Mr. Ducong. He explained he was considered a person of color, but in the rest of America, where he was a stranger, he was considered a white man. Hoping to show the jury how absurd the American racial system looked, and indeed still looks, to the rest of the world, he offered the statements. The difference between a white man and a colored man is that the colored man has a darker face than the white man, but you can find a quantity of colored men reputed to be colored men who have white faces. Creoles then, like Latinos now, accepted that in the New World, in the U.S. no less than the Caribbean and Latin America, people from different continents have been mixing for centuries. Ultimately, in this view, New World people have become a race unto ourselves, referred to as la raza in Spanish. But Anglo-Americans rejected this reality by engaging in the dastardly fool's errand of retroactively sorting New World people back into definitive races, a practice that continues to this day. And so towards the end of the article, the writer says, Americans long ago abolished the segregated water fountains, but the binary racial mindset survives both in the American psyche and in American outcomes in health, wealth, education, and criminal justice. But the Latino concept of la raza has the potential to again take up the torch of challenging American racism by challenging the idea of race itself. Through this lens, America is not a society of warring tribes, but a dysfunctional family. Warring tribes can only make peace treaties. Dysfunctional families are better adept to reconcile and heal. At the dawn of Jim Crow, W.E.B. Du Bois observed, quote unquote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The question of the 21st century then may be whether we continue to see ourselves divided by race or unified as la raza. So this term la raza, well, from what I know, it's been mainly Mexicans that have said that, but I think in the Mexican context, the word or the term la raza was made to reflect their mixed heritage. So I guess if you apply it to Latin America as a whole, it's kind of like portraying this new race, but a new mixed race, if that makes sense. So I found it very interesting that the writer of this article was like, you know, in reality, the United States is not any different than the Caribbean or the rest of Latin America, in that people have been mixing forever here. As taboo as the concept of mixing may have been or still is here, the truth is that it's been happening forever. You had people that mixed with the Native Americans. And then, of course, you've had white and black people mixing here since Africans were brought over, basically. As much as they may have been shunned, as much as anti-miscegenation laws may have been passed, the truth is there were still people mixing. And that's never stopped. Now, I mean, I do think that it's increased in occurrence. I mean, it definitely has, but it's always been there. So, you know, even to the most whitest looking people, you know, who's to say that they're 100% white? And even if you look at African Americans, the majority of African Americans are not 100% African. I mean, in reality, I don't think really any African American can say that they're 100% African. They are, in their vast majority, mixed as well, you know? So it just goes to show how, I want to say antiquated, but also how silly, you know, just this concept of race can be, and trying to fit people into these like concrete boxes, when in reality, the majority of us in the new world cannot fit solely into one box. We can't, because we don't. So going back to the Creoles of this article, I definitely feel like they were ahead of their time. And you know, it's just very interesting that at one point, you know, different racial categories were like here in the US, but then they scratched them out. They took them out and reduced it just to black and white. I find that very interesting. But again, yeah, these civil rights Creole leaders, I definitely feel like they were ahead of their time, and it's a shame that their efforts were like shut down. But yeah, I think, you know, as the world progresses, I think a lot more Americans themselves are also, you know, starting to, I don't know, kind of question the whole thing of race, or they're starting to think of themselves more in terms of their culture. You know, I've seen a few Black Americans say, even on my channel, that, you know, Black Americans at the end of the day are generationally mixed people, just like a lot of other, you know, Black groups throughout the world. They've created their own culture, and that they'd rather, I guess, identify with that said shared culture that they have, if that makes sense. Which goes back to the point made earlier of how it's, at the end of the day, it's your culture that binds you together more than anything. And I think that's even how, you know, despite all the light skin, dark skin crap going on YouTube lately, at the end of the day, using African Americans again as an example, they can all bind together, regardless of how mixed this one is and that one is. You know, they all have like that shared identity, which is their Black American identity. You know, that is their culture. You know what I mean? So anyways, I hope that made sense. If any of you guys want to see the full article, let me know. I'll provide a link. So yeah, that was it for this video, guys. So as always, leave your thoughts and opinions down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.